is so much confusion over the question of dietary fat. Is it healthy? Is it unhealthy? A lot of the science does seem to support the idea that added fats aren't that healthy, and they certainly aren't going to help you lose weight. And a lot of the science even suggests that high-fat diets actually cause you to gain weight. But what about ketogenic diets? What about carnivore diets? We've all seen people doing these high-fat carnivore ketogenic diets, losing lots of weight, becoming healthy. Why is it that people can eat high fat on a ketogenic diet, but people doing the higher carb, higher sugar type diets, why is it that they have to cut the fat drastically often to be able to reduce weight and reverse their poor health? Why is it that we can't seem to have carbs and fats together? And to add to the confusion, you've been told that it's glucose spikes and insulin resistance that's causing you to gain weight. So how on earth could a low-fat diet help you lose weight? I mean, fat doesn't even spike insulin or glucose. So why would a low-fat diet help people lose weight? What on earth is the mechanism by which low-fat diets help people lose weight and reverse poor health? In this video, we're going to dig into the science of how dietary fat interacts with the body to understand why dietary fat sometimes can cause obesity, but in other contexts, i.e. a low carbohydrate diet context, that dietary fat doesn't cause obesity and may in fact help to reverse the obesity. The new science makes sense of the observation that whether dietary fat will induce obesity or not depends on the context of the rest of the diet and also the underlying strength of the gut immune system. So if you want to understand the mechanisms, if you want to understand fat a little bit better and resolve a lot of the confusion, keep watching Science Coming Up. In my previous videos, I have presented just a small amount of the existing mountain of evidence that it is events in the gut which are responsible for reduced GLP-1 secretion, leptin resistance, obesity, and poor health. The model which I have presented states that obesity and poor health is caused by an overgrowth of problem bacteria in the gut. Problem bacteria damage bile in the intestine, which ultimately reduces GLP-1 secretion and increases inflammation by increasing leaky gut. The reduced GLP-1 secretion is responsible for leptin resistance, obesity, and associated poor health. We need to reduce levels of this bacterially damaged toxic bile in the intestines to reverse obesity and poor health. There are two different dietary strategies which we can use to reduce the levels of bacterially damaged toxic bile in the gut. The first is to starve out the problem gut bacteria, which are responsible for damaging the bile. We can do this by restricting their essential nutrition. The essential nutrition of the problem gut bacteria are dietary carbohydrates and sulfur-based amino acids. So, to starve out the problem bacteria, we can either do a low carbohydrate diet to starve the bacteria of dietary carbs, or we can do a plant-based diet to starve the problem bacteria of sulfur-based amino acids. Since the problem gut bacteria need both carbohydrates and sulfur-based amino acids, we don't need to restrict both at the same time. Just restricting one of these is normally enough to put a restraint on their growth. However, as discussed in my previous video, carbohydrate restriction seems to be more effective at keeping levels of the problem gut bacteria low. This explains why people on higher carbohydrate plant-based diets need to use additional strategies to help reduce the formation of this problematic bacterially damaged toxic bile. People on plant-based higher carbohydrate diets usually find that to be able to reverse their obesity and poor health, that it is not enough to just eat plant-based and restrict sulfur-based amino acids. This isn't enough to get the levels of problem gut bacteria sufficiently low. To avoid the formation of this bacterially damaged toxic bile, these dieters normally find that it helps a lot to reduce dietary fat as well. We can target the bile part of the equation. We can reduce levels of bacterially damaged toxic bile by reducing levels of bile, instead of trying to get levels of the problem gut bacteria sufficiently low. So the question is, how? How can we reduce levels of bile in the intestine? And this is where dietary fat restriction can help. Dietary fat is the major trigger for bile release into the intestine. If we can reduce our dietary fat intake, we can reduce the amount of bile that is secreted into the intestine, and therefore the amount of bile that is present and available to get damaged by the problem gut bacteria. This also explains why people on low carbohydrate diets are able to get away with eating a lot more fatty food than people on higher carbohydrate diets. Because the low carbohydrate ketogenic diet is more effective at starving out the problem gut bacteria, it achieves lower levels of problem gut bacteria. In the context of low levels of problem bacteria in the gut, the bile that is induced by eating a fatty meal does not cause problems because it doesn't get damaged by high levels of problem gut bacteria. So in the context of low levels of problem gut bacteria as a result of eating a low carbohydrate diet, the bile that is induced by eating a high fat diet does not cause problems. It does not reduce GLP-1 secretion, it does not induce leptin resistance, and it does not cause obesity and associated poor health. A high level of dietary fat and bile is not inherently a bad thing. High levels of dietary fat and therefore high levels of bile in the intestine is only a bad thing in the presence of high levels of problem gut bacteria, which are induced by high levels of carbohydrate, and by the same token, a high level of problem gut bacteria induced by high levels of carbohydrate are not inherently bad either. If there are higher levels of these potentially problematic types of bacteria, but levels of the bile are very low, then the problem gut bacteria are not actually problematic. They are only problematic in the presence of high levels of bile. So we can see that neither the problem gut bacteria or the bile are bad by themselves. They are only problematic when they are both present in the intestine at the same time. It is only when high levels of problem gut bacteria are combined with high levels of bile that they become this toxic duo, inducing the bacterially damaged toxic bile, which causes GLP-1 deficiency, leptin resistance, obesity, and associated poor health. This is unfortunately why, if you have developed a weight problem and leptin resistance, you are going to have to choose. You either have to go very low carb, higher fat, or if you are going to eat more carbohydrates and therefore have higher levels of problem gut bacteria, you are going to need to cut back on your dietary fat to keep levels of bile sufficiently low. Once you have developed a weight problem and leptin resistance, you can't have both a high carbohydrate diet and a high fat diet together. Let's take a quick look at the evidence that carbohydrate-induced overgrowth of problem gut bacteria do not cause problems by themselves. The carb-induced overgrowth of problem gut bacteria only cause obesity and poor health in combination with fat, which induces bile. In this study, published in Cell Reports, the authors found that feeding mice a purified diet of unrefined carbohydrate caused major changes to the gut microbiome, but this did not translate to an increase in body fat or an increase in glucose intolerance. The refined carbohydrate diet only induced obesity and glucose intolerance when the diet was also high in fat, i.e., the higher levels of problem bacteria induced by a high-carb diet only cause obesity and poor health in the presence of high levels of bile induced by a high-fat diet, i.e., the problem bacteria are only problematic in the presence of a high-fat diet. And as I will argue, the reason for this is because the high-fat diet increases levels of bile. The problem bacteria do not act alone. They need high levels of bile to be able to induce obesity and poor health, i.e., they need a high-fat diet. It is the combination of carbohydrates and fats in the diet that is required for the formation of bacterially damaged toxic bile. So let's look at the evidence that it is indeed the high levels of bile as a response to a high-fat diet, which is actually responsible for the induction of obesity and associated poor health. This study, published in 2019, supports the model that high-fat diets cause obesity and poor health because they increase levels of bile in the intestines. The researchers found that a high-fat diet did increase the concentration of the toxic type of bile, taurocolic acid, in the small intestine, and it increased the concentration of the even more toxic secondary bile acid, deoxycholic acid, in the large intestine. In my previous videos, I've presented evidence which shows that both taurocolic acid and deoxycholic acid reduce the production of GLP-1 in the gut and brain, whilst increasing inflammation in the gut, causing obesity and multiple symptoms of poor health. The idea that dietary fat causes obesity and poor health via increasing levels of bile in the intestine is supported by studies on bile acid binders. Bile acid binding resins bind bile in the intestine, prevent it from activating bile receptors. As predicted, bile acid binding resins do in fact prevent fat accumulation, improve obesity and metabolic disorders in response to a high-fat diet. i.e., the bile acid binders are preventing the root cause mechanism behind a high-fat diet which induce obesity and poor health. And that root cause mechanism is the presence of toxic bile in the intestine. And in another study on bile acid binding resins, researchers concluded that diet-induced obesity and fatty liver were markedly improved by a bile acid binding resin without decreasing the food intake. Hyperglycemia, high blood sugar, insulin resistance, as well as dyslipidemia were markedly and significantly improved by the treatment. These studies presented here are just a small amount of the total evidence which supports the idea that a high-fat diet causes obesity and poor health via increasing the levels of bile in the intestine. This, of course, would lead to the conclusion that a low-fat diet would therefore help to reverse obesity and poor health. So let's check the science. Is that what happens? Does a very low-fat diet indeed help to reverse obesity and associated poor health? A study published in the Journal of American Diet Association in 2003 put postmenopausal women on an ad-lib very low-fat diet over 8 months. This resulted in a weight loss of 6 kilograms and a decrease in percent body fat of 2.7%. The diet was completely ad-lib, so there was no conscious calorie restriction. That means no sense of deprivation. This automatic reduction of calorie intake and weight loss indicates increased leptin sensitivity. So, reducing dietary fat in the diet does indeed have the effect of reversing leptin resistance. Some of you at this point may be saying to yourself, well, I've done low-fat diets in the past and it didn't work. In fact, reducing fat probably prevented you from gaining more weight than you would have done if you hadn't reduced fat at all. You just weren't getting quite the results that you were hoping for. And notice that the study that I mentioned, the diet was a very low-fat diet. It appears that once leptin resistance has set in, to reverse that leptin resistance, you're going to have to go very low-fat in diet. And if you're having great results from a low-carbohydrate, higher-fat diet, stick with that. This is just advice for people who either don't want to or aren't getting the results that they wanted from a low-carbohydrate diet. People have to try and find their sweet spot for added fat, the point where they are still able to lose weight comfortably without causing health problems and increased appetite. If you yourself have tried strict low-fat, high-carbohydrate diets, what did you find was your sweet spot for added fats? Please share in the comments. But what is clear is that you are going to have to pick a side. You are either going to be low-carb, high-fat or high-carb, low-fat. You can't have both unless you are leptin sensitive and one of those very lucky people that have incredible immune control over your gut microbiome. For the rest of us unfortunate people who are trying to correct our gut and our leptin resistance, we are going to have to pick a side. We can't really have both. Watch this next video to understand why some people can eat carbohydrates and fats together, and to understand how strict you have to be with your low carb, low fat or low protein diet is determined by the individual strength of your gut immune system. Thank you for listening and hopefully see you in the next one.